Hey guys, I hope you're doing great today. This is our chapter number 21 in which we are going to talk about 30 important Git terminologies you must know as a DevOps engineer. Guys, in the last lecture we covered how Git works. And now there are a couple of terms you must know as a DevOps engineer because you are going to work with Git a lot in your day-to-day routine stuff. So these 30 important terminologies, I also wish that I have known them in the very first week of my DevOps journey. But since I don't want you to repeat such mistakes in your DevOps career, I thought that I should share these 30 important Git terminologies for your knowledge. And guys, it is really important to know these Git terms because you can be asked in your interview about these Git questions. In one of my previous DevOps interviews, I was asked about 30% questions from Git. What is a Git repository? What is the difference between local and remote repository? What is the difference between git fetch and git pull commands? So it is also from knowledge and interview point of views, you must know these Git terms. So let's get started and discuss each one of them one by one. So guys, the first is, what is a repository? A repository is a folder, a directory, which contains all the necessary files, code files, and your secrets, and so on. It contains a lot of data. It is your application's code. And each file and folder is actually tracked by Git. Therefore, the Git repository contains a hidden folder which is .git. And I have told you in my previous lecture that .git is usually considered as the database of Git because it contains every information, every log, every commit, every branch. So we can say that Git repository contains everything, including your code, source code, and files, etc. And those files, folders, and that source code is tracked by Git, and that is collectively known as a repository. Now, the second term, what is the difference between local repository, local repo, versus remote repo? Now, you also must know the difference between these two terms. If I'm talking about local repository, what does this mean? If I'm talking about a remote repository, then what does that remote repository mean? And as the name says, that local repository means that the repository on your local VM, and that cannot be accessed by other developers. It can be worked on by you only, and it is on your local VM. And remote repository means that the repository or the Git directory on a remote location. The remote repository is always on a remote server, and that can be accessed by multiple developers, all the software engineers and coders, programmers in your team. So the difference is local repository, it is on your local VM, remote repository, the repository on a remote server. And that can be accessed by you only, and remote repository can be accessed by multiple developers. Okay guys, now third term is Git working directory. Git working directory. Guys, it is not like the normal directories we have on our Linux VM. For instance, we have multiple folders, multiple directories, but not all these directories are tracked by Git. Only the directory which is tracked by Git is known as a Git working directory. And it can contain your source code. So this directory is tracked by Git. Now, what does tracked by Git means? Git tracking means that Git is always having a look on all the files. Git is monitoring them. Every time if there is a change, Git detects that change. For instance, if we have modified a file and then we checked in the previous lecture, we checked via running git status command, and Git told us that there has been some modification in that file. So that is actually Git tracking. Git always checks what is happening with your files, what is going on with your files, what are the changes happening with your files, and Git always tracks those changes. That is why it is a version control software. Now fourth term that is extensively used in Git is branch. In simple words, a branch is an isolated space for a developer. For instance, if we have this main repository and there are a lot of developers working on that code repository, and each developer can create his or her own branch and he can work on any specific folder, a specific feature. So branch A, B, C, D, E, F, and those branches are the different versions of the same repository. I can have the same content of the main repository in branch A. I can have it on B, C, D, and so on. So most of the times when developers are working on some features, they usually create a separate branch. And that feature is tested on that branch. And after the successful testing of that feature, any of these branches can be merged with the main or master branch. So for instance, if there are two developers on a single project and one is asked to integrate PayPal and the second is asked to integrate Stripe, both are payment solutions. So what do these developers will do? The developer A will create a separate branch for PayPal integration, and the developer B will create a separate branch for integration of Stripe. So that's how those branches, after their successful testing, can be merged with master branch. So that is why it is actually the practice to create different branches, and after the successful testing, those branches can be merged with the master branch. So in short, we can say that the branch is actually a different version of our main repository. Okay guys, now the fifth term is checkout. Now we know that there can be multiple branches in a single repository, and for instance, if I have three branches A, B, C, and I am at branch A, but I want to switch from branch A to branch C or from branch C to branch B, then I can use checkout, git checkout, and it is used to switch between different branches. So if someone is talking about checkout, it means that he is talking about switching between the branch. I can switch from A to C, C to B using git checkout. Okay guys, the sixth term is merge. Merge means to combine two branches. So if I have two branches A and B, I can merge both branches into another branch C, and that branch will have the code of A, it will have the code of B, and we will collectively get the files and code of both branches in another new branch C. Or we can also merge the changes of these branches into our master branch as well. So when developers are working on some features, they create branches, and when that feature is successfully tested, the final code or that branch is actually merged with the main or master branch. So merge means combining one or more branches. The seventh term is pull. You can take the pull of that branch. What does this mean? If some developer asks you, you can take the pull from branch ABC. It means that you can bring out the changes of branch ABC on your local VM. So pulling means to get changes from a remote repository on your local repository. For instance, we have this repository. It is a local repository, and we have this as a remote repository on a remote location, remote repository, and it has some changes, okay, and I want all those changes on my local repository. How can I get all these changes on my local repository? I will use git pull and I will have all these changes on my local repository. Okay, so pull means that to get the changes from a remote repo on my local repository. We will use git pull command. Okay guys, the eighth is actually the opposite of pull, which is git push. So if I'm talking about pushing some changes, now it is the vice versa of git pull. And in git push, I am going to push my changes from my local repository to the remote repository. So the difference is, you can be asked about the difference between git pull and git push commands. So git pull means pulling the changes from a remote repository to the local repository, and pushing means, git push means push the changes from your local repository to the remote repository. Okay guys, the ninth term is status. Status means what is the current status of any repository. If there are any untracked files, if there are any commits, if there are any files in the staging phase. So status tells us everything we have, and in the previous lecture we saw if we are modifying any files, we can run git status to see which files have been modified and what modifications have been done with these files. So the 10th term is clone. What does clone mean? Clone means to bring the whole remote repository on your local VM. We can use git clone command and we can use the repository URL to bring everything in that repository on our local VM. So by clone means that we can copy the full remote repository on our local VM. So git clone works like git clone and the repo URL. And then we will have all the contents, everything in that repository on our local VM, on our server. So the 11th term is cherry pick. Cherry picking means that if I have any change or commit in my branch A and I want to have the same commit, same change on branch B at the same time, then I can use cherry pick. Cherry pick will only copy that commit from one branch to another branch. And also cherry pick can be used to undo changes. For instance, you were writing the code and you pushed and commit that code, but you want to undo that code, that piece of code, because it is creating some errors. You can use cherry pick command to undo that changes. And guys, this is one of the most important interview question, that what do you mean by cherry picking in Git? So cherry picking means to copy the commit, to copy one thing from one branch to another branch at the same time. And it can also be used to undo some changes in one branch. Okay guys, the 12th term is fork. A fork is a copy of a repository that is on a remote server. And why fork is used? For instance, if I have this main repository, this is my repo, okay, and it can be on GitHub, but I want to do some changes in the code. So what would be the best practice? The practice is to fork, to take the fork of that repository. So fork is actually the copy of your main repository. And after that, you can make changes in that repository. And after testing those changes, you can then push the changes to the main repository. The 13th term is fetch. And as the name says, git fetch is also used to bring the changes from a remote repository to your local repository. So what is the difference between git fetch and git pull? The main difference is copying the files. When we use git pull not only fetches the changes, but also it copies all the changes in our local repository. So it means that when we use git pull, the changes, everything with that remote repository are copied into our local repository. Whereas using git fetch, we just know about the changes in a remote repository, but those changes are not copied in our local repository. So that is actually the key difference. Git pull not only tells us the changes happening with our remote repository, but also copies them on our local repository, whereas git fetch only tells us the changes with our remote repository, and those changes are not copied into our local repository. So that is actually the key difference between git fetch and git pull. Okay fellas, the 14th is head. Your head is actually your default branch, and most of the time the head is master branch. But whenever we switch from one branch to another branch, that head is also updated, and it points to the current branch, and it points to the new branch. For instance, I'm at branch A, so it means that my head is pointing to branch A, and now I have switched my branch A to B, so it means that the head will be pointed from branch A to branch B. So whenever we switch from one branch to another branch, the head is also updated and it points to the new branch. And also the other definition of head is it is the symbolic reference of any commit, and it is used to refer to the current commit. So in our git commands lecture, we will actually practically see if we check out, if we switch from one branch to another branch, the head gets changed, and we will see how that head points from one branch to another branch. The 15th term is index. In Git, index means the temporary staging area, and Git index is used to prepare the changes before committing them into the project history. So let me share it with an example to understand index more. When we run git add command, for instance, we run git add and dot to add the changes, it means that those changes are not added into the repository. Those changes are saved in some point which is known as index. And after that, we definitely run git commit command to commit all the changes into the repository. So when we run git add, those changes are saved in a cache which is known as index. The 16th term is easy, and it is master and main branch. So if someone asks you what is master or main branch, you can tell them it is actually the default branch of our Git repository. It can be master branch, it can be main branch, and not everyone has the access to this branch. And when some features are tested on other branches, those branches can be merged with the master or the main branch. So it means that it is the primary branch of our Git repository. The 17th term is origin. Origin means the repository URL. So most of the times origin means the remote repository URL. We are getting some changes from a remote URL, remote repo, and that remote repo URL can be considered as the origin. In other words, the origin is the shorthand name for a remote repository from where we have cloned the project. So it is the shorthand name of our remote repository, and it is known as origin. Okay guys, the 19th term is pull request, or commonly known as PR, generate a PR. So pull request is actually a request to merge the changes from one branch to another branch. Okay, so for instance, if I have been working on a project and this is my branch A, and this is my branch main branch, which is our primary branch, and my changes have been done, I have tested the code and everything is verified. So now I want to merge the changes in that branch into the main branch and I don't have access to the main branch. So what I will do is to initiate a PR, which is commonly known as pull request, and then the person who has the access to that main branch will accept this pull request and the branch will be merged. So the changes in that branch will be copied into the main branch. So guys, let me repeat it. Whenever we are going to test some functionalities or whenever a new feature is going to be introduced, that feature is actually worked and developed in a separate branch. Master or main branch are never touched because these are the primary branches which have the final code, and everyone does not have the access to the main or master branch except the development manager. And when any feature is tested on any branch, that developer will initiate a PR or pull request, and the development manager will review the code, will test the functionality, and he will get the feedback. And when that pull request is accepted, the changes are merged from one branch into the main branch. I hope that now this concept is clear. It is one of the most frequently used terms to create a pull request, PR. Okay guys, the 20th term is rebase. What is rebase? Rebase, it is a command actually, git rebase, and with the help of this command we can actually modify the history of our git commits. Since the developers are working on some repository and they're writing code and committing that code to a repository, we can modify, we can change those commits using the git rebase command. So let me explain git stash with a scenario. I have this repository, okay, repo, and I have two branches in this repository. This is my branch ABC and this is my branch XYZ. I was working on branch ABC, but due to some emergency I have to switch to branch XYZ to finish up something. But I do not want to commit the changes on my branch ABC, so I can use git stash and those changes will not be committed, and I can switch from ABC to XYZ, and after finishing the work on XYZ branch I can come back on the branch ABC to finish up my changes and then I can commit. So let me repeat it. I have two branches ABC and XYZ in the same repository. I was working on ABC, but due to some urgent task, I have to switch to branch XYZ. But I do not want to commit the changes that I have been working on branch ABC. I want to leave those changes uncommitted, and then I can use git stash and those changes would be saved but not in the commit state, and I can finish up my emergency task on XYZ branch, and then I can come back to branch ABC and finish that work and then commit those changes. The term is revert, and since from the name revert means to reverse the changes, and in Git revert means to revert the commits. I have already pushed that commit but I want to revert it. I can use git revert to revert that commit. In Git, reset means to reset everything, including your working directory, your branch, your head. Everything is reset when we use git reset. And if we are not able to reset, we can use git reset hard. So it will forcefully reset the head, the changes, the working tree, reset hard. The 24th term is Gitignore. For instance, this is my remote repository and I'm working on my VM. This is my local repository, local repo, and it contains a number of folders, folder A, B, and C, directories. I don't want these directories to be pushed to my remote repository. So I can add those directories that I don't want to be pushed in .gitignore. This is actually a hidden file, and it contains the files, the folders, the log files that we do not want to be pushed to our remote repository. I can simply add those files or directories here in that format, abc and file name, etc. So Git will check the .ignore file, and all the folders and files mentioned in this file will not be pushed to our remote repository. The 24th term is gist, G-I-S-T, not Git, it is gist, and it is a utility by GitHub to share the code snippets with the developers. The 25th term is diff. So diff stands for difference, and in Git, diff means to see and compare the changes in your code. In our previous lecture, you saw that I have one file and I have made first change. This was my first change, okay? And I didn't commit the file. Then I modified again and I inserted the second change. And then after that, I checked with git diff command, and git diff told us that your file has been modified and there are that many number of insertions in that file. So git diff actually compares the changes in your code and tells you which files have been modified or changed. So the 26th term is blame, and in Git, blame means to show who modified any file for the last time. We can use git blame, and we can mention the file name who was changed by whom. So blame is actually used for troubleshooting, and it also identifies the person who was working on a specific file. So 27th term is git log. For instance, if I want to see the logs of all the previous commits and who committed those changes, I can use git log to see the commits history. So git log is actually a wonderful Git command to see the commits, logs, and history. Guys, Git hooks are actually the Git scripts. In .git folder, we have a number of directories like log, like info, and we also have hooks. There is a hooks directory which contains some scripts. So if we want to automate any tasks in Git, we can use Git hooks. The scripts are copied in hooks directory, and when there is any change in that repository, those scripts are automatically triggered. So if we want to automate anything in our Git repository, we can create scripts and place them in the hooks directory. The second last term is Git LFS, large file storage. So Git LFS is actually a utility to manage the large files. For instance, in our code, we can have large video files, audio files, or large data sets. So Git LFS actually manages all those large files separately. So we can say that Git LFS is actually a Git extension that is only designed to manage the large files in our code base. So our last term is personal access tokens. So for instance, we are going to clone any remote repository on our local VM. We definitely have to use the personal access token. So personal access token plays the role of a password. You can create customized personal access token. You can grant the limited permissions on any personal access token using github.com developer settings. So when we modify any changes in our code and we want to push them in our remote repository, which can be hosted on GitHub, we can use personal access token for authentication. You can watch my previous lecture in which we created a personal access token and how we used that personal access token to authenticate with a repository on GitHub. Alright fellas, I hope that you have got a lot of concepts cleared regarding different and important Git terms like Git Rebase, Git init, Git repository, remote repository, origin, head, and so on. However, I will create a different Git interview questions and answers video, but you guys can consider these 30 Git terms as 30 interview questions. As a DevOps engineer, you must know what do these terms mean. So make sure to watch this full lecture, and still if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments and I will definitely answer those questions. And make sure to subscribe my channel DevOps Molvi on YouTube. I will watch you in the next video.